Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everyone. I'm impressed and just want to give you all some snaps for Saturday morning, 8:51. You're all here, committed, and part of today. So thank you so much for having me. I'm doing a double advance things with the slides. So please tell me if I'm looking at my notes here and you're seeing something different up there, okay? Flag me down. So I'm thrilled to be with you, and what I want to focus on today is really think about not only K-12 civic learning nationally, but also we have a new study that just came out this summer about California in particular. So I want to share a little bit about what we're learning about that, and also think together about what are we seeing in terms of new horizons, and really think about what are the ways in which we can consider what's next, right? How can we continue to be inspired and hopeful? This morning was already inspiring with our song, with the artwork around us, with Dr. Morales. We've already started off in that way, and so I want to continue that conversation to kick off the rest of the day together. So, as James mentioned, let's see, hold on. Already started. Let's see. Hold on one second. No, I did. Let's see. The true test of my technology has already begun. Battery issue. Let's see. All right. Should I wave it down?
Magically say next slide.
Does that work? Do I have to do that every time? Right? I think as my former sixth grade teacher self, my students would have loved that. All right. So as James mentioned, I have been the co-director of the Civic Engagement Research Group based out of UC Riverside for the last 12 years. And in that role, we really try to think about how can we conduct research, not to crunch numbers, but to empower good conversations about how do we advance more frequent, more high quality, and more equitable civic learning for young people. And also develop resources to support all of you as leaders and educators in trying to do this important work. And now I'm very excited to join Facing History, excited and sad, a little sad, but excited to join Facing History and ourselves. And for Facing History, they are launching a brand new Next Generation Civics initiative. And that is incredibly exciting for their national and international reach. And they're really thinking about how to use lessons of history to help prepare students for civic life. So using intellect, empathy, and also ethics as thinking about choices. What are the choices that we make and other people have made throughout history to stand up to bigotry and to hate? So I'm coming to you with two hats this morning, wearing two hats, and I'm thrilled to be here with you. So, all right, here's my moment. Oh, here we go. Okay, great. All right. So, as we all know, our democracy is and has always been precarious. It is a constant project that we all have to work on, right? But as we all see and we all feel the signs of concern around our civic and political landscape surround us, right? I'm sure you are all thinking about this, concerned about it in many different ways. And unfortunately, we have seen a lot of trends throughout history and over time that give us a lot of concern. So the first being that we're seeing a lot of declining trust in our democratic institutions, as many of you already know. So we see this not only in trust in government, which has dropped from 77% to 30%, But we also see it with other institutions like our public schools. We see it even in our medical systems. So we see this pattern happening over the last few decades. It's not just been in the last 4 or 8 years or in these last few presidential cycles. It has been a trend over time that's important for us to think about. And we all are in important positions to be able to make a difference around this. We also see that there is a decline in people who believe it is essential to live in a country that's governed democratically. So we're seeing this over a generation. So you see this drop in people who believe that it is essential, and people born in the 1930s, for example, highly valued living in a democracy, whereas people born in the 80s were much more indifferent to this, and that continues today. We also see that civic and political discourse is stressful, right? There are a lot of polls nationally that find having conversations about civic and political issues, which is a foundational piece of our democracy and how we live together and engage with one another. It doesn't mean we have to agree with each other, but how do we have conversations has been many people have reported it as stressful and frustrating. So we see in a poll from the Pew Research Center that 7 in 10, and this is in particular online, 7 in 10 social media users now say that it's stressful to talk about politics online. So we see that this has dropped a lot, even from between 2016 and 2020. You can see here the increases. Now, of course, I think we would all agree that having a political argument on Facebook is not what many people enjoy. Not many people change their mind, right? So, of course, having these kinds of conversations online is very challenging, right? Very difficult. So I think that's a given. But even offline, so this is not just about online conversation. Even offline, 53% of Americans say that talking about politics with people that they disagree with is generally stressful and frustrating. So we're seeing this online and offline for a variety of reasons. So now that I've thoroughly depressed you on Saturday morning, it's 8:59, let's turn to reasons for hope, okay? So we have a lot of reasons for hope. So while there's many indicators that the health of our democracy is quite bleak, there's also many reasons for hope. So youth are more engaged and are leading the way in many social movements and efforts that we see around us. So you can see here, this is data from the Center for Inclusive Democracy, that youth voting is actually on the rise. And so it's important for us to think about that while oftentimes youth are seen as unengaged, I often try to think about it as they are uninvited sometimes, right? Or unrecognized, or maybe not all young people are fully supported, right? So how do we think about really paying attention to the ways in which young people are engaged, and that takes a variety of forms, and how can we open up more and more pathways for that? So what I would love to do now is give you a chance to turn and talk to someone sitting next to you. And what I would like you to do is think together about, first, introduce yourself, and if you could briefly share with each other about one of the following. What's one reason for hope that comes to mind about our society and community? So let's add to our list of reasons for hope. So please turn to someone next to you and share that. Or you could share about one inspiring example of youth civic engagement that you witnessed recently or you heard recently. So each introduce yourself and then think of one reason for hope that you have on your mind right now this morning. So we'll take a few minutes to do that. Hopefully you're filled with a few more reasons for hope, inspiring examples, to really think about how we sustain ourselves in this work, right? It is hard work. And so it's, I think, important to periodically remind ourselves of these examples and these reasons for hope. All right, so as we talked about, there are these long-term trends that are showing us signs of concern about our democracy. And that these long-term trends really have to do with fundamental challenges. So as we think about ways to make a difference or to be able to attend to these challenges, we have to think about the ways in which they connect to these broader tensions in our society around misinformation, around hyperpartisanship, thinking about racism and other forms of oppression, diminishing commitment to democratic values, and also this distrust and inadequate knowledge of democratic institutions. But luckily, schools are an incredibly important, not the only, but one of the very important institutions that can offer a very substantial response to this, right? And this is not about teaching young people what to believe or what to think, but instead, schools play an incredibly essential role in helping young people develop their own informed opinions, teaching them the skills of how to engage with others in conversation like you just did, whether you agree or disagree with one another, in respectful, right, and productive ways, and also helping young people understand the ways in which to get involved in their community around issues they care about that are thoughtful and effective, right? So this has been a cornerstone of our schools from the very beginning. So as we all know, public schools have had a democratic mission throughout American history, charged in preparing young people for participation in democracy. And luckily, you'll see on the next slide, a majority of likely voters agree that it is very important for schools to teach more about civics. So this was a recent national poll, and 79% of people agreed. We also saw from this national poll on the next slide that across the political spectrum, more than 70% of likely voters agreed that education should encourage vigorous debate about different points of view, even about controversial issues. And that is not to say that those discussions of controversial issues at all times should be a free-for-all, right? We just lay the topic out on the table and let young people go at it, right? We all know that, right? How we do this, how we support teachers to do this well, and how we support students to engage in these kind of learning opportunities well is incredibly important. But there is general agreement that it should be happening, right? So that is also another reason for hope. So when we talk about civic learning, what is civic learning? So let's think together about, and we have this framing of civic learning that we use in our work that I have found really helpful. So we tend to think about civic learning as a process through which young people develop knowledge, skills, and commitments, or you could think of it as dispositions, right? To interact effectively with their fellow community members and to address shared problems, right? And this can be about preparation for both civic engagement and political engagement. So in terms of civic engagement, we think of that as practices seeking to promote the public good through maybe non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations, or more informal community work. But civic learning also supports young people to engage in political engagement. So that can include activities that aim at local action, state action, federal action through maybe more formal avenues like voting, lobbying, petitioning, right? And of course, there's a great deal of overlap between these two. I don't mean to say that they're distinct and separate, but it is important to say that civic learning should prepare young people for both. The other thing that is important to recognize that I think is often left out of the conversation, but I wanted us to think about it together this morning, especially as the theme for today is thinking about new horizons. I think another component of civic learning that is often overlooked is what's called civic imagination, right? To really think together about how do we imagine where we want to go. It's not just about what we're against, it's about what we're for. Where do we want to head, right? So when we think about civic imagination, and this is from our colleagues at USC, Henry Jenkins and Sangeeta Shrestova. So they think of it as civic imagination is a tool and a concept that can help us imagine a better world, to imagine the process of change, to really think about ourselves as civic agents, that we can make a difference, and also to imagine our connections within a larger community and to how we would form solidarity, connections with others to be able to address these shared problems, and thinking about bringing an imaginative dimension to our real world spaces. So I think today I'll ask you to try to draw on your own civic imagination as you go through the workshops and think about what might be possible. Where do we in our school or our district or in our community want to end up in 5 years? What would we like to see? And of course, we are not only thinking about schools and districts as an important place where civic learning happens. I think it's also really important to say, I think of sort of civic learning as happening in an ecosystem, right? So we are partners with a lot of other collaborators in our community. So civic learning can happen in formal and informal ways for young people and for ourselves, right? So we also think about it in after-school programs and clubs, community-based organizations, local government, even in online spaces, network communities, faith-based organizations, families. There's a lot of ways in which civic learning is happening all around us for our young people, and how can we help build those connections? The other good news is that we see from research that there are a lot of benefits to civic learning. So we do see that when there are high-quality learning opportunities happening, we have a connection to, there is a correlation to really important outcomes for young people. So for example, when young people have the opportunity to discuss current and controversial issues, we see that that promotes students' engagement with political issues and elections. We also see this with service learning or civic action projects, that students develop a sense of civic agency, they learn how to work with other community members. And of course, engaging in digital civic learning is incredibly important. So as we think about civic learning today, we have to think about also digital civic learning. How do we help young people navigate all of the information that's coming at them online? How do they determine credibility, trustworthiness of that information? And actually, in a recent study that our team just completed with data from Chicago Public Schools, we also found that schools that are responsive to student voice, there was actually a connection and a correlation to student attendance and to GPA. So we saw chronic absenteeism drop in the schools where students said that not only teachers, but also leaders were responsive to them and responsive to their concerns. So this is an incredibly important finding. Not only do we want to promote student voice more generally for young people, but we also see that it has a relationship to other academic outcomes. So that's really good news. We see all of these benefits from these range of civic learning opportunities. But unfortunately, we also see that young people have insufficient opportunities in school. So this was actually a study in California done by my colleagues. And while this is a little dated, other studies still show us the same patterns are true. So what we found from surveying students was that 34% had never done service learning, 36% had never participated in a simulation in high school, 68% did say they learned a lot about the structure and function of government. So that's really good, but guess what? They were in a government class when we surveyed them. So 100% of them were in a government class, but only 68% of them said that they had learned a lot about the structure and function of government. So while I want to celebrate that one, ideally we would see that one be even higher. And we also found that only 40% said that they were often in classes where a wide range of views were discussed. Okay, so we're seeing that these kinds of opportunities are not frequent enough, and we also see that access to these kinds of opportunities are inequitable. So we see this along the lines of SES, right? So we see that students in higher SES schools were more likely to discuss how laws were made, were more likely to report participating in service activities, and also more likely to take part in a debate or some kind of panel discussion. We see this also in terms of parent education levels. So this is based, the next slide shows you, based on NAEP scores. This was actually from 2010. But access to civic learning opportunities also plays out based on parent education level. And we see it as well along lines of race. So it's incredibly important when we think about not only do we want to have more of these opportunities, but we want them to be more equitable and accessible to all young people. We want all young people to have the kind of civic knowledge, skills, and capacities that make them more likely to participate in our democracy and have their voices heard. So as many of you probably know, the NAEP study just came out again. So the national, we see, oh, sorry, let me go back to this slide. Oh, I'm clicking, James is helping me. So the National Assessment for Educational Progress, on the next slide, you'll see that this study came out again recently, and unfortunately, you'll see that there is a decline in civic knowledge, and this is the first time that we've seen this decline. We've had a little bit of an increase over time, but the scores have dropped, and they're now back on par with 1998 when the test was first done. So this is another, unfortunately, sign of concern, right? That we really need to be thinking about the ways in which we're helping young people build that civic knowledge. So luckily, a lot of states have responded to these concerns about our democracy, I think are responding to the decline in civic knowledge in important ways to try to think about how do we support civic learning. So let's turn to California. And I want to share a little bit from a report that we just published about a month or two ago. And what we wanted to do was think about how is California doing in terms of K-12 civic learning. So I'm going to share a couple of brief findings with you. And we actually did this study in 2020, and then we came back and did it again in 2022 to see if there was any progress. So I want to tell you what we learned. So the first thing that we found is that the civic and democratic goals that you might find in a mission statement or a vision statement, we looked at a representative sample of districts across the state to see is anything about sort of civic readiness in addition to sort of college and career readiness showing up in these sort of visions or mission statements. And what we found is that there was a little bit of an increase from 2020, but that it is still very marginal. So what you can see there is that only 18% of our sample substantially address civics in their mission or vision statements or the kind of democratic aims of schooling, right? So that means about 36% were silent on the social purpose of education. So we want to think about how do we articulate this in our goals, right, that we have in our schools and in our districts. Second thing we found is we looked at LCAP plans, the local control accountability plans. And as you all know, this is not only an opportunity to articulate goals, but it's also the ways in which schools or LEAs often communicate how their goals translate into resources and budget, right? So it's an important place to look for in what ways is civic learning, is that a commitment, and are there ways in which that democratic purpose of school shows up? So we did see between 2020 and 2022 that there has been more than a threefold increase, so from 17% to about 54% in the districts in our sample that mention civics or democracy or citizenship. So this is promising. We are seeing a little bit of an increase, but again, it's still only around half of the districts in the sample address at least one of these terms, right? So 21 of the 46 districts made no mention at all of these terms. May be interesting to note that the word cafeteria came up a lot more. And while we want our young people to eat, we also want our young people to be prepared for democracy, right? So here's another thing that we looked at as an indicator to support for civics and democracy. So we all know that civic learning, that history and social studies is an important home for and support for civic initiatives. But civic learning can and should be taught across content areas, across grade levels, right? We don't want to wait till 12th grade. We don't want it to only be in history, social studies. But it is often an important first home for that, right? And so what we wanted to do is, are we seeing any increase in staffing for history and social studies across the state? And so in the sample that we looked at, we saw really big gains. So you can see the dark line is 2020, 2022 is the light blue. So in ELA, there were gains in terms of support staff at a district level. So often, you know, that's translated into training, curriculum materials, right? A lot of different kinds of support. Math saw a big jump. Unfortunately, science did not. And history, social studies, we did see an increase. But if you see in comparison to these other subject areas, we are doing a disservice to our history and social studies teachers, to all of you in the room. And we are also doing a disservice to our students if we are not only creating more opportunities for this, but not supporting, right, our educators on how to do this well. So the next set of findings I want to share with you are about the state seal of civic engagement. So this is a really exciting initiative that was passed by the State Board of Education in September of 2020. And for the state seal of civic engagement, we are really excited to see how this might create an opportunity for more civic learning throughout the state. It can be earned by students in grades 11 and 12, as you all may already know, and it's really focused on students demonstrating excellence in civic education and participation. So it's not just about civic knowledge, it's also about practicing those things that you're learning. There are 5 criteria put out by the state, and LEAs have the opportunity to draw on that to create their own local criteria. And so we were excited to sort of follow what's happening with the seal across the state. So I'm going to share a couple of things around that. So here's what we've found so far, that the state seal of civic engagement is gathering momentum in California, but it is only reaching a very small percentage of students. So in 2020, 2021, there were 28 local education agencies that adopted the seal and ordered insignia. So about 5,359. So what we did was we did a really rough calculation to sort of see like what percentage of the 4-year graduating cohort would that be in California, right? So obviously students can earn it in 11th grade, but the majority are earning it in 12th, and it's only 1%. Only 1% of students earned it. Now, the seal was adopted during COVID. There were just a few things going on for schools at that time. It's very understandable, right? But we were interested to see how have things progressed now over the next 2 years that it's been. So in 2022, it did double, which was really exciting to see. So it went up to 10,000 of this seal insignias were ordered, and so that jumped to about 2% of our population of 4-year graduating students. Now, I just got these numbers from CDE, but they're preliminary, so please don't quote me on this, okay? They might change. They're still working really hard on looking at all the numbers from 2022, 2023. But what we saw is that it did jump up again, which is very exciting. So again, we have this momentum. It was about 12,603 that were awarded, but that's only 2.9%. So again, we really want to think about celebrating this momentum, but continuing to grow and increase these opportunities for young people. So you may be interested on where it's happening in the state. So you'll see in the next slide, there's a little bit of a map. So we're seeing this overall increase, but we're still seeing the seal offered in areas, either in urban areas or areas that are adjacent to an urban area. So we really need to think about how to support rural areas or hard to reach areas. And our numbers around insignias are very imprecise at this point, right? The numbers that we have at the state level are how many seals were ordered, right? So we really need to, and the state is actually, I'm excited to note that the state is really working on and thinking about how to have more precise data, and potentially they are considering adding this to the dashboard. So really thinking about how this can be another indicator around civic engagement. So I am very excited, you may have seen in this map, to celebrate. Now this is from 2021, 2022, but let's give a round of applause and some snaps to our LA County districts that gave out the seal. And then we also want to celebrate and give some claps and snaps to our Ventura County districts. And do we have, so this does not count 2022 or 2023. So does anyone want to shout out any districts that should now be on that list? Any new districts or teachers that are in the room that you know your school or district gave it out and it's not included here? Feel free to shout it out. Okay, well, I think we're going to have even more each year. So congratulations to you all for all this hard work and launching this alongside a lot of other things that I'm sure people were launching and working on. All right, so in terms of the districts that we know gave out the seal, here's a couple of other things that we learned. So as I mentioned, the seal is gaining traction in the state, and we are seeing that increase. And the distribution, as we saw on that map, is largely in urban areas or adjacent to urban areas. And actually, when we looked at all the districts, at least for year 2, that were offering the seal, the size of those districts actually varied pretty widely. We had a number of really small districts, but unfortunately, a majority of the largest districts in the state were not offering the seal or were just starting to offer it in very small numbers. Now, we know in a large district it's very hard to roll something out, right? So it does take time to do these things. We also saw that the districts that are offering the seal are quite diverse demographically in terms of students receiving free and reduced price lunch, English language learners. However, we can't be entirely sure because we could just only look at the demographics of the district overall. We don't know about the individual students that are earning the seal. So I think it's incredibly important that we think about this on a state level, but also you all in your districts have the ability to look at this data, right? And not as an accountability piece, but as a reflection. Who are the students that are earning the seal, and how can that help us think about making it more accessible and equitable? So on average, districts that awarded the seal did so for about 11% of their 12th grade population. So again, we want to think about how to make it more equitable and accessible. And then the other thing we found is that dialogue and professional development was pretty limited. We did a survey with principals across California, and we found that that was pretty limited. So again, I think part of this is a communications campaign. How do we raise awareness about this opportunity? Because it really does give us a chance to lift up our students and celebrate what they're doing. So one of the important hallmarks of the seal, and this is language from the state, from the California Department of Education, is that it is meant to be accessible to all students, regardless of their backgrounds, communities, and experiences. So it is not meant to be a competitive thing where only the top few are earning this. It is also not meant to be about academic achievement. It's meant to be about civic knowledge, but it is also meant to be about civic participation. And we want that for all of our students. We want to give them the opportunity for that. So this is a different kind of recognition, and the ways in which we implement this should follow that and really think about the ways in which it does not perpetuate these patterns that we see in civic education where, on average, white students or middle-class students or students in higher track classes are getting these kinds of opportunities more so than their peers. So I want to share 3 themes with you that we have found from a range of studies that we've done looking at the state seal, but also civic learning in the state. So I want to have you think about these 3 things before we wrap up. So the first is this idea of student voice. And hopefully many of you will stay in a little bit because we're going to have a youth panel. So the organizers are practicing their effort to promote student voice, and super excited to have a number of students here share with you. But I think these civic initiatives, what I would encourage you to think about is that as you either deepen your civic work in your district or you start it and launch it, that it is important to really think about how can we do this in a way that is democratic, right? How can we model those kind of processes? How can we have students be part of how we roll out the state seal? And how can they be part of our planning committees or stakeholder committees, right? How can they help spread the word to their peers? And the other thing that I know we've talked about, but the other theme I would ask you to think about is equity and accessibility. So how do we define civic excellence as a goal for all of our students, right? Not the top few. How do we design equitable service learning opportunities so they happen as part of the core curriculum, not something in after school that only a few students get access to, right? And how do we also examine these sort of traditional eligibility measures, either for clubs or the seal, right, to really think about how that may be a barrier for some students. And then the third thing I would ask you to think about is infrastructure. No one can do this alone, right? This is very hard work. So find your colleagues, find your allies, and think about how this also can be integrated into the systems that already exist at your school, at your district, in your county office of education. How can this align with other important initiatives such as social emotional learning, ethnic studies, right? How does this really help you do all of the work that you're doing better and in deeper ways? And how do we also create more staff and support for this? So those are 3 things I'd ask you to think about. So before I close, I want to just kind of step back and review what we've covered. So here's where we started. We started with me depressing you, right? And we talked a lot about how our democracy is very precarious. No surprise, I know we all know it, but I know that's where we started in our conversation this morning. But you all also helped me think about that there are a lot of reasons for hope, and we have to hold on to that. The other thing we have to hold on to and we have to help communicate is that we know that civic learning matters. We know that our community wants it, right? That likely voters are saying that civic learning is important to happen in schools. And we know based on the research that it works. When high quality civic learning happens, we see important positive gains for young people. And as we talked about, there is important momentum in California, and this is really exciting. California is leading the nation in this work. We are part of a handful of states that are really trying to move the needle on this, and that's very exciting with the State Seal of Civic Engagement, with democracy schools, there's a number of things happening in California that can help support this work. And then the last thought that I'll leave you with is it's important for us to build on that momentum and to proceed with this work, but we want to think about it and do it in a way that is democratic. We want to model these things we want our students to learn. So we want to think about democratic processes. We want to keep equity and accessibility at the forefront of our minds. If we plan with that from day one, then we can move towards that throughout. And then, of course, we want to think about infrastructure. How do we build systems of support for our teachers, for our colleagues, for leaders? And then the last thing that I would say is that I'm going to leave you with 3 questions. So here's what we covered, and here are my 3 questions to encourage and support you today as you go through all the different workshops, the different programs. To really think about What gives you hope about your school? What gives you hope about your district, your students, and your community? What are those reasons for hope that you can think about and lift up? And also, let's use our own civic imagination, right? What do we imagine civic learning and youth civic engagement could look like in our school or our district or our community? So if you were to think about 2033, let's meet back here. 2033, what would that be? The 29th Constitution Day event. What would civic learning look like in your community? What do you imagine? What would you hope for in that time? And then, based on that, what are some small steps? Don't think about huge leaps, but what are some small steps that you could take today to build towards that vision of where we're going to end up in 2033? And what will help you get there? So I want to thank you for inviting me to be with you. I am very excited to be part of this conversation with you today. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions or would like more information about any of the things that I shared or the studies or the information. If that can help you spread the word or you can help draw on that in your work, please feel free to reach out. And I'm excited to connect with everyone today and enjoy your workshops and your sessions.